All right, welcome everyone. Today we have a special presentation from the National Fire Protection Association on fire-resistant construction techniques. Fire is a natural part of many North American landscapes, but it doesn't have to be a disaster when it occurs. Michele Steinberg, NFPA's Wildland Fire Operations Division Manager, is here to discuss concepts and techniques around siting, designing, building, and maintaining homes and neighborhoods to resist ignition from wildland fire. Here's a little bit more about Michele's background. Michele Steinberg is the Division Manager for Wildland Fire Operations, the National Fire Protection Association, where she leads a team dedicated to wildfire safety education, advocacy, and outreach. During an 11-year span, she oversaw the development and implementation of the National Firewise Communities and USA Recognition Program, which now reaches more than 1.3 million residents of nearly 1,200 communities in 41 states. Ms. Steinberg has worked since 1989 in the areas of natural hazards and land use planning, floodplain management and flood insurance, and disaster safety marketing and outreach. She has previously served as Special Projects Manager for the Institute for Business and Home Safety, Hazard Mitigation Specialist for the FEMA New England Regional Office, and Regional Planner for the Massachusetts Flood Hazard Management Program. She's the author of numerous articles and technical documents on disaster safety and mitigation planning, and currently serves on the Executive Committee for a new American Planning Association membership division, Hazard Mitigation and Disaster Recovery Planning. She holds a BA in English and American Literature from Brandeis University and a Master of Urban Affairs from Boston University. Now, I hope that during the course of today's presentation you'll submit questions for Michele. To do so, simply use the question box over on the right side of your screen. I'm going to review those questions later on and pose them to Michele during the Q&A time that we've set aside near the end of the webcast. Michele, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Mike. I'm happy to be here today, and I want to thank Green Builder Media for this opportunity to speak to you. I think Mike has given enough of my background, so I'd like to move on to the agenda. I know that we have a number of code officials, builders, designers, and architects from all over the country and actually around the world on this session today. So our agenda, we're going to cover essentially what is the scope and magnitude of the wildfire threat, primarily in the U.S. and North America, but we will talk about the global reach a little bit. I want to focus, though, on what you're interested in, which is the wildfire risk factors for homes. Homes and structures and communities that you may be in the process of building or designing or planning. I do want to give you some concepts around designing for fire and good ideas and best practices. And we'll finalize this presentation with some good resources you can take a look at after we're done. So how big is the wildfire problem? It's a little bit hard to get our arms around, especially because definitions sometimes trip us up around what constitutes a wildfire. But in one definition, we have the National Interagency Fire Center in Boise, Idaho, that keeps track of U.S. wildfire activity. This is a chart showing activity over 25-year span, and I can tell you that the trends have more or less continued in this manner. The top bar shows the number of fires accounted for every year by this reporting system, and you can see that it varies quite a bit. If you actually averaged it out, you would find that, you would find that it sort of flattens out. Every year is different, and it's very difficult to predict from year to year how many fires there will be. However, you can see on the bottom line, the blue line, that fires are getting bigger. So these are the number of acres burned reported to the National Interagency Fire Center. They're trending much larger over time, and unfortunately that means that eventually, with the amount of growth that the U.S. has experienced in its wild and natural areas over the last 20 to 30 years, these big fires will eventually encroach on human development, habitation, and homes. If you think that this problem is just in California, we have some evidence to maybe change your mind about that. Just a couple of examples. North Myrtle Beach in South Carolina in 2009 lost 70 homes in the matter of a few hours. And Bastrop, Texas in 2011 underwent a summer-long fire siege that saw nearly 3,000 structures destroyed. And of course, as I mentioned, it's not just a U.S. problem. This is aerial from King Lake in Victoria, Australia from 2009. This is known as Black Saturday. Unfortunately and sadly, 173 people also perished in this fire that destroyed numerous homes. We have a rather clumsy term for what we're talking about today, the wildland-urban interface, and unfortunately that description makes it sound as though wildland is on one side, there's a line, and there's the urban area. This is not very descriptive, and you can see from the pictures that this set of conditions can look different all over the place. It's really a set of conditions, not necessarily a specific place, where fire in the vegetation reaches beyond trees, brush, and other natural fuels to ignite homes and their immediate surroundings. This trend of developing into beautiful natural areas or turning over agricultural land to development has meant that people are building in harm's way, often unknowingly, often not understanding the natural risk and the historic risk from wildfire in their areas. I want to just touch off on a little bit of the science of how fire acts, how it behaves. And in the typical fire science in the lab, on the left, you know that the three legs of the Firewise triangle are oxygen, heat, and fuel. We must have a fuel source, air, and heat, as well as an ignition to sustain combustion or to start and sustain a fire. If you remove any one of those things, the fire goes out. And when we say fuel, I tend to think of a can of kerosene. It can be kerosene, gasoline, wood, coal, paper, basically anything that will burn. And in a wildfire, the triangle to the right shows you the complicating factors of what happens in the natural environment. So in addition to fuel, which now becomes the vegetation, we have weather that is impacting the amount of oxygen and where it's going. Humidity, temperature, and wind, especially wind, are huge factors. And the terrain. Topography will influence the heating of surfaces and fire spread. And the fuel, again, it's not gasoline, but vegetation and houses. So the behavior of the fire in the natural environment is influenced by these factors. So when you're thinking about developing and you're trying to understand if you even have to think about wildfire risks, you want to take a look at these three factors from that triangle: the fuels, the weather, and the terrain. I'll get into the fuels first, and what we mean by that typically is looking around at the type and arrangement of the vegetation. This is a very simplistic photo, or image I should say, of what happens on a surface fire. So the things that are on the ground that provide fuel, like grasses and small shrubs, allow these fires to burn on the surface. Ladder fuels are those intermediate weeds, vines, taller shrubs, and small trees that can carry fire from the ground, laddering up into the larger trees. What that looks like in the real world, a surface fire can be creeping along the ground, like the photo on the left, or it can be laddering up from the fuels on the surface into the trees and shrubs. Crown fuels are referred to when the fire gets up into the crowns of the trees. This means that it has a lot more surface to burn. You have much larger flames, longer flame lengths, and that radiates a lot more heat. They radiate heat to ignite the others, so when you have radiant heat, the structure is ignited, or the tree is ignited, the fuel is ignited, without the flames even touching the surface. You also have, as we see in this little cartoon, embers coming off of this fire. So the house being ignited that you see on the right of the image is being ignited by an ember that's far, far away from where the crown fuels or the major flames exist. So this is a tree doing what firefighters call crowning out, which means the fire has moved from the surface up into the crowns of the trees, and the tree is in flames. These large flames produce significant radiant heat that is a real danger when we talk about how homes ignite, which we're about to get to. So understanding what we can do to design with fire in mind, first we need to understand how it is that homes burn down in wildland fires. There are a lot of myths involved. One is that fires will burn anything in their path, that they flow like a tsunami or a lava flow, and that is not how they operate. Again, they need fuel, heat, and oxygen to keep going, and fuel is probably the most important key piece for us to consider in design. But at any rate, homes burn down one of three ways, or a combination. A fire is very dynamic, and so things are happening on the surface, in the crown, embers are flying, there's lots going on. But scientists have found over and over again in experiments and post-fire investigations, they estimate that approximately half of all homes burned down in wildland fires are due to the impact of embers or firebrands. This is because flammable roofs, decks, will catch embers and allow them to burn. Openings in the home, such as vents, can let embers in. And so this is a very common way for homes to ignite. One of the reasons, or one of the puzzling things that we see after a major fire, is homes completely destroyed. And if you think about on a nice sunny day when there's nothing going on, a small little ember gets into your house and starts to burn. There's lots you can do if you're at home to call 911, to get help, to maybe even put the fire out yourself. But in an extreme wildfire, thousands and thousands of embers are hitting the surface of homes and yards and land at the same time, and everyone has been evacuated. So there's simply no one there to put the fire out, which is why the homes end up totally destroyed. The second way that homes burn down is through the impact of surface fire or ground fire. Essentially, fire can be moving through uninterrupted fuel, such as tall grass, which will carry fire right to the home. It's a really bad idea to have flames touching your house. So anything that can carry fire is a consideration. Again, the surface fire can be carried up into the crowns of trees and become much larger as it goes into the trees. And also, winds can make surface fire move very quickly. Grass fires can be incredibly destructive and dangerous because of how quickly the wind will cause them to move, the fire to move. Finally, we have crown fire or radiant heat. And we tend to focus on this because this is the large flames as human beings that are vulnerable to heat. We should rightly be very afraid of that from a survival point of view, but they aren't actually the biggest problem typically for homes. If a home is close enough to large flames or a large radiant heat source, of course that's a danger. But these flames, although they radiate an immense amount of heat that can ignite a home from a distance without flames touching the home, we have the advantage that these fires burn very quickly at one location and move on to consume fuel. So there is an opportunity, and I'll speak to the research that shows us what that opportunity is, to mitigate for the idea of radiant heat. Probably the hardest thing for us to wrap our heads around as people who live in homes, work in home building, is thinking about the home as fuel. We find over and over again that homes that don't survive wildfires tend to be more flammable than the nearby vegetation. You'll find often, and I'll show you some pictures of homes that have been destroyed with green vegetation still around them. So this is because the features are fire prone, including flammable roofs, siding, and attachments. Windows that are exposed to heat and flames, they break and let the embers in. So do unscreened openings. Debris in nooks and crannies, such as your gutters and complicated roof line, will catch embers. And new research is finding that the near space to the home, within about 5 feet of the home, is very vulnerable. In an extreme wildfire, besides your home being vulnerable as fuel, you're vulnerable to the fuel generated by other structures. Fires will move from the wildland or the vegetation to become an urban conflagration where structure-to-structure ignition is what causes the major part of the disaster. Even worse, homes burn for a long time without interruption because everyone's evacuated and the firefighters are elsewhere trying to control the fire. They generate large embers and significant radiant heat, and this is the reason why you have that significant structure-to-structure ignition. This is a picture of my size 8 woman's boot next to an ember that came from a house that burned to the ground in San Diego County in 2007. So the home was surrounded by green vegetation, a green slope, and nevertheless was completely destroyed. This is another image of homes that are more flammable than their surroundings. If you can see, I've circled the homes destroyed. You can see the green space in the middle of this development. You can also see that lava didn't flow over these. Fire didn't flow like a wave over these homes. The homes were more flammable than what was around them. So we have to assume primarily embers were the cause of this fire, of this destruction. The good news, however, is that homes can survive. Firewise design is effective. Basically, it's also cost effective. There are many, many choices with standard residential building materials and designs that can be used to make the home much less vulnerable to ignition. Research supports this Firewise design concept. Post-fire studies starting as early as 1961 in the Bel Air-Brentwood fire in Los Angeles County in California showed that if homes had non-flammable roofs and the vegetation had been modified within at least 30 feet of the home, the variable rate was 86 to 95% survival in similar studies. This is a great example from a recent fire in Cle Elum, Washington, just a few years ago. There's another picture of this home with the fire all around it. And the metal roof and basically the mitigation work and the modified vegetation around the home prevented this home from being destroyed. There were not firefighters putting water on this home, so it essentially saved itself. Another experiment that was very important in understanding how we could design homes and live our lives compatibly with wildfire was the International Fire Modeling Experiment in 1998. It showed that radiant heat from large flames had to be very close for a very long time to actually ignite wood walls. And as I mentioned, crown fires moving through the forest will burn and move on to the next fuel and not stay in one place very long, as opposed to your home, which has to stay where it is. So if we can simply move some distance between the wood walls of the home or the vulnerable places on the home and that radiant heat, we have a very good chance of having homes survive. So this became known as defensible space, and that's something you hear about a lot. But I want to expand your thinking into beyond simply moving vegetation away from the sides of the home and focus on what we can do at the home itself. It's very critical. I'll show you now a very short video, courtesy of one of my former employers, the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. The current research is supporting this notion that it's the little things in design and landscape that can pose big hazards to your property. IBHS runs a testing lab in South Carolina where they can do full-scale testing on full-scale homes on wind, hail, and fire. And they use their wind blowers to put embers onto a home and turn the home. So what you'll see here is just some short clips of one of the experiments where you see mulch and shrubs igniting as the embers start to hit. You can see people moving through this video too. And that shows you that there's not a lot of heat here. Otherwise, the people would not be able to walk through. So just from these little embers hitting this home, you begin an ignition that carries to the front stoop and quickly gets into the re-entrant corner. You can see here the firefighter is putting this out. And that re-entrant corner, again, anywhere that embers can go, if they follow the pattern of the wind, you can actually get a clue from walking around a property to see where leaves and debris collect and where snow might pile up in colder climates. So I want to introduce, besides the concept of defensible space and just focusing on the vegetation, a concept called the home ignition zone. We have a little diagram here that's showing the near space to the home of 0 to 5 feet, the home itself, and everything around it up to 200 feet. So there's different recommendations of essentially some rules of thumb of what to do in these areas. And I do want to point out, too, that Firewise principles are really effective, and you don't necessarily have to be in the highest hazard zone to make them worthwhile. These simple off and green techniques to resist exterior ignition hazards and ember entry really pay off. And they can be used anywhere, whether your home's exposed to a raging wildfire or a cigarette into the landscaping mulch, which is the resultant factor is here in this photograph. So the home ignition zone includes the home, very important for builders and designers, in addition to its immediate surroundings up to 200 feet. So what happens here in the home ignition zone affects what will happen to the home during a fire. A lot of the wildfire safety advice focuses intensely and almost exclusively on the landscaping and plants around the home, calling for that clearance and defensible space. However, even if a landscape is designed in perfect compliance with these recommendations, fire can still reach a home through the firebrands that we showed that land on the home, and the home's exterior and openings really have to be considered in the design. In addition, we have little sayings, little catchphrases, little rules of thumb around design that also help us think what we should be doing to make a safer home. So one of them is, if it's attached to the house, it's part of the house. So you see our little diagram has a deck and a fence. And this is just a perfect example for probably about 10 years ago in Virginia. A good friend sent that to me, and you can see that the wooden fence is acting like a fuse. This has been observed by firefighters on scene for many, many years, and most dramatically recently in the Waldo Canyon fire in Colorado in 2012. Just because it's been observed doesn't mean it's been studied. The good news is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, their fire lab is now testing wood fencing assemblies to demonstrate what happens to them in this kind of exposure, but also, of course, to give us better tips and tools to advise folks of what they can do to minimize this kind of ignition. So with Firewise construction, the principles are to use rated roofing materials, and there's many choices. You can see some examples here, and to pay attention to a roof assembly that keeps this at a high class, a class A, of basically a roof that is very difficult to ignite. Ignition-resistant exterior walls are great to have. They're not absolutely necessary, but the best you can afford and design to is really going to help. We can also, of course, mitigate with that good old landscaping and keeping the radiant heat away from the sides of the home. They are not as vulnerable as roofs, but it's an important consideration. I mentioned vinyl siding should be supplemented with metal screening. Vinyl siding won't ignite to carry the fire, but may melt away with enough radiant heat and expose the underlayment, and that's where you have problems. Roofs and details. Complicated roofs are shown to have more hazards. This image is thanks to Dr. Steve Quarles, who also is at the IBHS testing lab, but this is from his UC Berkeley Builder's Wildfire Mitigation Guide, and I will give you that link again at the end of the presentation. The edges are vulnerable, and gutters and vent openings are vulnerable. So these are all things to consider. If you can do a simpler roof, you'll have less opportunity for embers to collect and potentially have edges and openings where you really don't want fire to be. Firewise construction also involves windows, vents, and attachments. A very good and easy practice is to use double pane glass on windows. What happens in radiant heat exposures to windows is that they heat up and basically break. And once they've broken, they've reached the house. If the outer pane breaks and the inner pane holds, you have a much better chance of not having an ignition. Tempered glass, of course, can be used on large windows, picture windows, and on sliders. Enclosing eaves, fascias, soffits, and vents is very important. Of course, with vents, we need airflow. Currently, the recommendation is 1/8 opening or smaller metal mesh so that it doesn't fail in a fire, it doesn't burn, but also minimizes ember entry. I will show you a little bit about vent vulnerabilities in a moment. Also, it's important to protect overhangs and attachments, removing fuels from these areas, as we'll talk a little bit about maintenance towards the end of this discussion, keeping people from piling things that could burn underneath, on top of the various attachments, and covering openings in the home. So this is another short, I'll cut the video off, it's a little longer than the other, but this is another video from the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. What they're finding is still early, preliminary findings, but you can see the embers attacking the test building from the outside. You can see the little eave over to the center of the picture. And you can see a close-up of an exterior view of gable end vent with a 1/4-inch mesh screen. Essentially what they're finding is that using finer mesh screens at the vent openings will reduce the size of the ember, although not eliminate embers getting into the attic or the crawl space. You can also see here the interior view of this gable end vent with a 1/4-inch mesh screen that this is rather vulnerable. Because it's perpendicular to the wind flow, it's more vulnerable to the entry of wind-blown embers than vents with openings that are parallel to the wind flow. So gable end vents and vents in the blocking of open eaves, they're more vulnerable. So a preferable design might be a soffitted eave. So under eave inlet air would be an opportunity. They've also found, which is good news, that even in the worst case of observed ember entry into attic space, wood members, trusses, and plywood did not ignite. So again, just to recap those preliminary findings, And the good news is that Dr. Steve Quarles, who's been doing this research, will be presenting additional findings at NFPA's Backyards and Beyond Wildfire Safety Education Conference this fall in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. We're eager to hear what he has to say, but these preliminary findings are very useful in thinking about what can we do now to minimize the likelihood of ember penetration if we have the opportunity to build a new home. We also, from the research that IVHS is conducting, are finding that the immediate zone or the near zone to the house within about 5 feet needs special attention. You saw the earlier video of the embers piling up, getting into the re-entrant corner, which you can also see towards the center of this diagram. This is really an issue and makes the home much more vulnerable. Designing not only the exterior of the home, but considerations for the landscaping and design and the materials that are used near the home is very, very important because of this vulnerability. Finally, attachments and outbuildings are also critical. This is a rather humorous, I think, version of what not to do, courtesy of the UC Berkeley Builders Wildfire Mitigation Guide. These are all part of the fuel package from a fire's point of view. Decks, fences, outbuildings, porches, all can radiate heat or create surface fire that can carry to your home. Unfortunately, too, with decks, not only do they offer a flat surface with a collection of embers, they also tend to be places where people store things underneath or allow debris to collect underneath that can also add fuel to the fire. So I want to offer, as we get into this, some good ideas and best practices for what you might think about doing in the design of homes that you found are in areas that have a wildfire risk. This is just an image from a booklet we put together a few years ago, a guide to Firewise-friendly developments that gives sort of a primer for developers and designers to think about the features they could use, especially in a subdivision design. But very few jurisdictions outside the state of California have consistent wildfire risk mapping and regulations for new construction. I know that there are a number of code officials on, so I hope that you do have some questions and comments for me towards the end. But there are standards out there. So these best practices and standards include NFPA and ICC model standards for new development and retrofitting in wildland urban interface areas. And the California Building Code, of course, includes wildfire regulations as well as standards for testing of different materials. They actually have a product list that they will check on products to see if they meet their requirements. So that's very useful, especially as folks looking for the right kinds of materials and what passes muster. So again, standards are available. This is just an example from the NFPA.org site. If you type in NFPA.org/ the number of the code, if you happen to know it, it will pop up to this page that's very useful for taking a look at our standard. In this case, it's the standard for reducing structure ignition hazards from wildland fire. So you can learn a lot more about it, and you can actually read it for free online. So what do we say in the standards? Obviously, because of the research, because of the 50 years of history, that we know that roofs are the most critical part of a Firewise home, roofing choices are critical, and many choices and styles are available. The key is to pay attention to the whole roof assembly and to try to design for the simplest roof line possible to minimize ember collection and ember entry. Details around the edges, such as capped end tiles that you see in the foreground here, are critical to minimize the amount of debris and, of course, embers that can get in and make that roof vulnerable. With vent design and material, again, another vulnerable area of the home, consider the need for vents in design. I'm aware that some designs in some areas can be ventless. The research, as you saw, also suggests that we should look for alternatives to gable end vents where we can. Numerous products, though, are on the market now, inspired by the California standards that have been set in place and the recognition of this vulnerable spot. So there are various what are branded as ember-resistant vents that have baffles or honeycomb openings that can reduce ember penetration. They also have intumescent coatings that resist heat and flames, which is also a good design feature. Of course, testing is still ongoing since these are relatively new products to the market. Firewise plants and landscaping, again, if you're designing within a subdivision or an HOA, if you're trying to develop the best features for your properties, this is a very critical choice. Now, plant choices themselves are important, but of course, all plants will burn. The things to keep in mind are perhaps judicious use of hardscaping and thinking about that near area of the house. You don't want anything that can burn within about 5 feet of the edge of the walls and foundation. So think about walls, pathways, stone, metal features, especially the places close to the house. You can use trees and plants in the landscape to make it beautiful, to make it environmentally compatible, but there's really some great tips that you can use that keep that beauty and aesthetic and environmental soundness without presenting more of a hazard to the home. The Firewise website, firewise.org, maintains plant lists that have been developed by university cooperative extensions that are very useful on a regional basis. Site design is critical. So if we go back to that fire triangle, considering your area's terrain, weather, and fuels, as well as fire history, and remembering that other houses can turn into fuel when the fire is more extreme. This image is showing a concept of these overlapping home ignition zones. So typically you don't have a home that's all by itself with nothing around it. There are things and even houses within its zone that would have to be mitigated also. So I know that Mike mentioned our Firewise Communities USA recognition program, which you can look more about at the end of this talk. But this concept that we need to work together to make our communities safer actually is borne out by the fire science, because if my home is perfectly safe, but I'm too close to your home, which is vulnerable to ignition, I'm really not that safe. So the fire science really promotes the idea that these homeowners need to work together, and communities need to be designed with fire in mind, not just single individual properties. Finally, I'd like to make a pitch for ease of maintenance. When the home is built safer from the start, this is a wonderful advantage that most don't have. We talk a lot in our program about what we refer to as the 98% problem, with only about an average of 2% of the building stock around the country being built new each year. We talk a lot to people about what they can do to their existing home. However, if it's built safer from the start, it's built with Firewise principles, there's some wonderful advantages that people have to be safer. But as we know, people will change their property over time, will perhaps maintain it well or not maintain it so well. So think about how to make things easier for the eventual owner of that property. Privacy is a huge concern for folks who want to live near nature. If they end up planting a line of flammable shrubs to screen them from their neighbors, they've reduced the fire safety of that home, for example. Storage is also another consideration. If people are using firewood, for example, it's one of those things that we really recommend people don't keep hidden under the deck or near the house. So how are they going to get at it? Might be a thing to think about. And finally, maintenance of the landscaping and the design that you put in place. You'll notice in this picture, this is from Utah, that these people are going to have a very difficult time mowing or treating vegetation on this very, very steep hillside. This is where we start to hear lots of stories about goat herds being employed in the West to mow down these areas that are very difficult to get equipment into. So consider how things are going to be maintained over time. So when applying Firewise principles, I'd like to leave you with a few thoughts. Consider the site and the principles of the home ignition zone. Consider that passive protection can save homes and lives. We really, in a major wildfire, can't rely on fire services being at every home. It's just impossible when you have hundreds of homes exposed at the same time. We also don't want people to stay in their homes trying to protect their homes at the last moment. And so building in passive protection, building in a home that is resistant to ignition means a much greater chance of survival. And remember that a home that doesn't ignite can't burn. Firewise design and material choices are cost effective, and there's many choices. And I believe Firewise principles are also green builder principles. Sustainability and safety, to my mind, are compatible concepts. So I'm going to leave you with some resources on the next 2 pages, and then I hope we can open it up for questions. So first of all, our Firewise website, firewise.org. A few things I'd like to point out. Our online learning page has a wonderful virtual workshop series that have been recorded and are on YouTube and are easy for you to follow. Some of them have transcripts as well. And 2 of them feature Dr. Steve Quarles, who I've mentioned extensively throughout my talk today. They are really helpful if you are getting into what is the preference on the building material, what's the definition of ignition resistant or combustible or non-combustible. He does an excellent job on some of those workshops. We also have our Safer from the Start booklet and video that gives that sort of general overview of the principles and gets a little bit more into the standards you might consider employing in your development. And finally, we have the list of Firewise plant lists from around probably about 20 states that have provided them to us. The second on this list is nfpa.org/wildfire. This is the NFPA overall wildfire webpage that deals with research, that deals with other programs, that deals with our training. But in this area, you can find a study on community regulations that shows that even though standards are available, many jurisdictions do not adopt them. But those that do have some commonality, some good reasons for adopting them, and have some similar kinds of successes and challenges with enforcement and the safety of their communities. There's also a best practices guide which came out of this study for wildfire community planning and development that you might be interested in. And these are all free resources. Finally, I'll point out we have these codes and standards for NFPA. I'm mentioning Standard 1144 as our prime example that deals with structural design. It also can be read for free online. And I'd like to also make a pitch. If you are a code official, designer, manufacturer in the fire service, we need you on our standards committees. Our committees are made up of volunteers, and our staff simply makes that process run. So that's a very important role if you're interested in fire safety. Finally, 2 educational offerings. We offer a contract seminar called Assessing Wildfire Hazards in the Home Ignition Zone. We can bring this 2-day classroom effort to you. We also have a certificate of educational achievement that goes along with this if you care to take the exam affiliated with that class. And last but not least, we have a wonderful diverse conference occurring this fall, October 22nd through the 24th, in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, called Backyards and Beyond. This attracts folks from the fire service, community officials, insurance industry folks, researchers like Steve Quarles, who will present there, and more. So I hope that you'll consider joining us. Finally, for more information outside of NFPA's resources, disastersafety.org is the IBHS page. Its wildfire area includes research reports and information from its testing lab. Even more information from Dr. Steve Quarles can be found at extension.org/surviving_wildfire. And finally, for those in California, this is a great example of how they've developed their hazard and building codes. It's a rather long, cumbersome URL, so I won't try to repeat it, but you can use it, and I believe that this will be available after the class, after the seminar today. So you'll be able to access that URL to find that out. It's also easily findable on the search on your browser to simply type in California Wildland Building Codes. With that, I thank you for your attention, and I turn it over to Mike to see if we have any questions.
Thank you very much, Michele. And yes, hopefully the audience does have some questions. Please use that question box over on the right side. I know I certainly have a couple of questions. In your bio, there was a mention of your work with the Firewise program, but I believe it's for the U.S. What are other countries doing in regards to fire mitigation programs?
Well, I think that in the international scene, we always, being based in Boston, people often wonder why on earth I'm involved in wildfire study, but it is very interesting. I have the perspective that I can see that it's not only national but international, but of course we bow to California in the sense that they've invented this stuff. They've known what to do for a long time, and they've been sharing that with the rest of the world. In a similar sense, Australia is a very fire-prone country that has also dealt with this problem for a long time, and much of the good research and prevention activity has come out of that country. So Australia is a very big leader in fire safety from wildland fire, as they call it, bushfire. Interestingly enough, our Firewise program and concept seem to be desired and exportable. And so NFPA actually has agreements with the country of South Africa, with Canada, with the United Kingdom, and with now currently with a forest restoration initiative in Lebanon to be able to use our information, the word Firewise, that we don't want misused, and that we're supporting each other on learning of how these community-based activities are taking root and growing in those different countries. So we've actually seen a lot of interest in what some might call a community-based fire management scheme that involves community residents from the get-go. And I think we believe that until you can get to each individual property owner with this information, we're not going to solve the problem too quickly.
All right. I had one other question. Is there a certain time of year where wildfire risks are increased?
Well, I've heard my colleagues say that there's no longer a fire season in California, that it's year-round. We actually do look at typical regional seasons. For example, in New England, March and April are some of our most fiery seasons. In the South, in some places, they have a March, April, and then an October fire season where, because of the natural cycles of their vegetation, things dry out. So it really varies around the country. And pretty much any time of year, at some place in the United States, you can see fires burning.
Gotcha. Sad fact there. We have a question from Stephen in the audience. What is usually considered within the 100 and 200 perimeter distances? And I'm assuming he's referring to landscape and that kind of thing.
Right. Now, assuming you have the textbook, you've got 200 feet, which many homes don't have that much space. What we usually recommend is to start in that home ignition zone. We use the little catchphrase, start with your home and work your way out. And that's important just from the research that you heard me quote about how vulnerable the house itself and the near space are. So that is effective. And it also helps the homeowner if they're having to mitigate on an existing structure that they can actually tackle most of the things we tell them to do in that space. As they move out into the landscape, though, doesn't mean you have to clear all trees. And the further away you get from the house, the less you really have to do. Typically in that 100 to 200 foot zone, what you'd be looking at is if you have steep slopes with heavy vegetation, doing some thinning projects to take out the number of trees per acre may actually be way over what it needs to be. And that's actually true in many areas of the western U.S., is that what people think is natural is actually an overgrown forest. And so that might be a consideration. If you happen to be butting up against lands where people have dumped things or put things that are flammable in that area, looking at those kind of features. But mainly it would be kind of thinning out large stands of trees that could present that radiant heat that would then carry the fire or move the fire closer to the house.
Gotcha. You know, I've got a follow-up question to that then, because maybe it's outdated thinking on my part, but I thought I recalled seeing a recommended, almost like a landscaping ring around the home of about 10 feet to help prevent the spread of fire. And I don't remember if I saw that from the Fortified program or Firewise. I'm not sure. And I want to make sure that I'm clear. In looking at what you presented, it looks like the thinking of that has changed a little bit.
Right. I think that there's a few things in there with the research that we're finding. Now, the zones are fairly fluid. It's very, you can see it's a cartoon. It's a little bit generic. The 30 feet that you'll hear a lot, not consistently, but a lot, actually comes from that crown fire experiment that I mentioned. That was the minimum distance on flat ground with large trees burning, creating a crown fire effect. At 30 feet, they were not igniting the wood wall. So in other words, you could be as close as 30 feet if you're a wood wall, not a person. You could be as close as 30 feet without suffering, without burning. And so that's where the idea that, okay, if we clear everything out from the edge of the property or the wall to the 30-foot zone, we're good, which, yes, you're good for radiant heat on flat ground, but if you're on a slope, you might need to clear further. If you don't want to have erosion, you don't want to take up every piece of vegetation, so you need to be judicious about what you're doing in that zone. What the further research has found is very near to the home is the little things, you know, the debris, the stuff you were working on that you piled up against the side of the house and forgot about. Those things will catch embers, ignite your home, and it's all done. So that near space to the home becomes very critical. As you move further out, the issue of radiant heat becomes less critical. But the near home is where embers and surface fire will absolutely impact you if you don't pay attention to it. Does that help?
Yeah, no, it does. It does. A question from Matthew. He wanted to know, the image that you showed, the concentric circles, some green building programs, you can earn points from planting trees that provide shade for the home and hence reduce the cooling load. So how do you suggest people try to balance those two interests?
Right. I think I had and maybe didn't show, among the many, many, many pictures that I had the choice to show in a short period of time, folks that have put the trees right at the foundation, and now you have a tree growing right up the side of the house. That's a no-no. It's not good for the tree. It's not good for the house. And this, of course, is a cartoon where not many people want no trees around the home. We've actually had folks, many of the folks that work with us work with the community, and will go walk on the site, and people get nervous about their trees. Now, if the tree is not overhanging, if the branches are not overhanging the house, if the roots are not coming up under the foundation, if you don't have it right up against the house, the tree might not be the biggest problem. And especially if the tree is in good shape, especially if there's not a lot of stuff under the tree that are going to bring flames up, especially if it's something like a maple tree that is not a specifically flammable species, it will burn, but it's not a big danger zone. You can have a tree. You can have a few trees. It's very site-specific, and that's why I try to reference folks to those regional plant lists and design ideas, because these cartoons are super generic and meant to just show you a general sense. So it's not the greatest, this isn't the design guide that I've showed. It's just getting a sense of the various zones.
Gotcha.
So shading for trees is great when it's done well. I think the National Arbor Day Foundation actually has some wonderful guides about building with trees that incorporate the very great benefits of using trees in the landscape, but also have some good fire safety information. So they've looked at that issue of compatibility of those two things.
Okay, gotcha. That's good advice. I had a question from Elizabeth. She wanted to know, you showed an example of burned housing surrounded by green vegetation. I think it was that neighborhood, and I don't know if it was just parkways or a golf course running through there, but it was obviously very striking. How much does the presence of water in the vegetation, there's the picture there, contribute to that?
Well, the very well-watered grass, as you can see, didn't burn. You see some areas did burn that may have been, I don't know if they were grassy or shrubby or what they were from this picture. You can also see in the foreground towards the left, bottom of the picture, some scorch or burn on what looks like some plantation trees, but again, not all of them burned, which probably had to do with wind direction at the time. But you also see some pine trees on the edge of, and you can't see my pointer because I don't have it on. If you look to the left corner where we've got a circle to the left and then a gap, you see some pine trees that are fine. You actually see some houses that are fine. So some of it was wind direction, but you also see with those houses that are fine, the roofs are on, so presumably they had decent roofs, and they don't look like they have a lot of vegetation around them. So there's the immediate zone vegetation issue, and it definitely has to do not only with whether you water things or not, but is it the kind of plant that is more prone to carry fire and burn? One example I'll give you is a juniper bush. You can have the best well-cared-for juniper bush in the world, but it is a plant that likes to burn. So if it gets going, you're in trouble. It's a very flammable plant. And so the green grass, if it's kept watered, is totally fine. And again, there's separation there, and the grass is not the problem.
Okay. Want to make sure to remind people in the audience that if they've got any questions, please submit them into the question box. We'll get to them very quickly. David had a question. What is your opinion on controlled burns? Is there such a thing, or does it depend on the circumstances?
It depends. That's a great answer. Controlled burning is a technique that's used by land managers in a number of parts of the country. The South is actually most well known for prescribed or controlled burning, and it's a land management technique because many, many ecosystems around the country and around the world are actually fire dependent or fire adapted. Fire dependent means they actually need fire to propagate. Even certain animal species need fire to happen in the landscape. The lodgepole pine, for example, has cones that will not open unless they're heated. And so when the fire happens in Yellowstone, people might think it's a disaster, but it's actually a natural event that just takes a long time to happen and then a long time to recycle. So controlled burning is a good practice when it's used continuously, it's used safely. Unfortunately, the conditions of many of our forests particularly in the western U.S., are such that any fire now introduced on the wrong day could be disastrous, just because the forest is much thicker, the health of the forest maybe isn't so good in terms of drought and pests, and the control burn might get out of control, which is a big fear and a valid fear for land managers. It's just very hard to replicate the benefits of fire on a landscape with mechanical means. So it's kind of it's a tough sell for a lot of folks. I have seen in Florida where they've used it quite successfully, and actually the land managers like the Firewise program that we employ, because then residents are much more welcoming, not only of the firefighters, educating them, but understanding what the natural landscape needs to have done to it to make it survive.
Okay. We also have a question from our friend Susan. She wants to know, isn't the use of green grass and the watering it requires at odds with water availability in dry, fire-prone areas?
Sure. And again, a lot of these things are trade-offs. I think this is one example where, you know, they say the golf course, but the houses are burned, so maybe not what you wanted to achieve there. You can see that the fire scorch in this picture is coming down going through the mountain here. So again, these homes were vulnerable to embers coming at them from this big ember shower coming at them, not from that side. And certainly the golf course arrangement is not ideal for every place that wants to conserve water. So we actually talk a lot about in development, xeriscaping, hardscaping, low water plants are great for these areas. And those plants very often are fire-resistant plants. Ice plant is one great example. So this particular arrangement is just meant to show you the vulnerability of these homes. I think that you know, we see it over and over again with green trees standing right next to houses that are gone, where you realize that the fire didn't come from the house, but was coming from the embers and landing on the vulnerable homes.
You know, you just mentioned a term that I think was the first time you'd mentioned it the entire time, and that was xeriscaping. Mm-hmm. I guess I'm surprised that I didn't see, or if it was in there, I apologize for missing it. But the you know, more of a mention of that. I would think that would work well with fire mitigation.
It absolutely does, and I apologize if I gave the landscaping piece short shrift in our discussion, but xeriscaping techniques are very, very good. And again, California is a leader. They have, I'm pretty sure LA County has put out information that they call WaterWise and Firewise, and so they really have melded those things because of the ongoing water, it's not new, water restrictions in California in particular are so top of mind that they really do want to cut back on the way that people use water in ways that are wasteful, in ways that really don't fit the environment very well. And so xeriscaping is a wonderful opportunity to introduce you know, a water-wise lifestyle and a fire-wise lifestyle. I want to mention, too, if anybody's ever gone to Santa Barbara, the retired landscape architect for the city is a fellow named Billy Goodnick, and he's written some amazingly great columns on concepts that really fit well with what we're talking about. So recognizing that Santa Barbara is a highly fire-prone environment and encouraging people to design and landscape with their own natural environment in mind. He also does some pretty funny stuff with crimes against horticulture, as he calls it, veg, and he's very anti-lawn, and says that you know, if the country was settled from west to east, people in New England would have cactuses in their front lawns. So so it's all about the aesthetic in a lot of places and getting people used to these looks that also bring them a lot of benefits.
You know, you mentioned communities in California. I know that Santa Monica has and there's others too, that have a turf buyback programs that are going on now, especially with the restrictions on water usage that have been handed down by the governor in California. I think, you know, I think some of those turf buyback programs are already in existence, but certainly since, I believe, April now, they've started to really increase.
Right. That's great. I hadn't heard of that program, but that's a super incentive by government to try to get people to do things and maybe change that aesthetic. And I think that if there are designers and landscape architects listening, you have such a great opportunity to introduce things that are really beautiful to people that they will never have thought of because they're just used to seeing what they think of as normal, and introducing that new aesthetic that can be environmentally friendly, can be safer, is so important. And I know you're all very creative people, so that you will find ways to do this.
Well, I don't see any more questions in the queue, so I'm going to go ahead and take the opportunity to thank you, Michele, for sharing your time and your knowledge with us today, and certainly the audience as well. Thanks to Stephen and our friend Susan for submitting their questions. Up, you know what, Chris just sent one in, and I want to get to him because I'm admitting it now. I'm showing preferential treatment to a firefighter. Chris says, yep, you keep coming, Chris. Chris is a wildland firefighter, so thank you for joining us. He's actually monitoring a fire right now, yet still attending the webinar, which is great. My crew does fire mitigation in western Colorado, and they've done the only 2 Firewise communities on the western slope. He's curious as to your opinion, Michele, to susceptible fuels around homes or within common areas of HOAs.
Right, so that's a design element we hadn't really discussed. I kind of had to gloss over a few features here, but I think what he's referring to is, as the subdivisions developed, the common areas, the shared areas, depending on the community, might be ignored in that sense of what they can do around fire safety. So I know in our area of the world that open space preservation is a big deal. Unfortunately, at the municipal level, often it means we buy the forest and we ignore it. So it's not well cared for. It's not considered for, aesthetic. It's not considered for health. And unfortunately, it can become a fire hazard. So that's one area with our program of trying to get communities and basically neighbors to work with each other. What we often find is some of the first projects that they will do is to address what's going on in their common areas. So whether it's along roadsides or in the town forest or the area's natural lands, that they will work with firefighters and work with forestry specialists and state government to try to get their lands in a better condition, and that's a wonderful thing. But that's a very important thing, because if you have fire inside the community coming from these areas, you've got a real issue. So you want to look at that asset of open space and common area, but it has to be maintained and it has to be addressed.
Yeah, and I'm glad he brought up the common area part, because obviously we've been focused on the properties, and rightly so. But it is something that I think often kind of gets overlooked. I know certainly I did. I didn't even think about it in the context of this webinar, but it was something very astute to bring up. He does have another question for us. Are there different standards on fire mitigation in different regions of the country?
I guess that it gets, depending on how specific it gets, a different region might identify particular kinds of vegetation as more of an issue because of the differences around the country. Certainly, folks typically do not take a model code or standards such as NFPA standards and adopt them without any changes. They tend to get changed. The unfortunate part about that is these standards are developed from research, and if you leave something out, it might be that critical thing that we just found out would make the difference between saving your home and having it burn. So we do try to recommend that if folks are going to use standards to try to keep them standard and to not change the important pieces, as I'm trying to convey, the safety of the home is a package deal. Roof right down to the roof to the eaves, to the walls, to the foundation, and out to that home ignition zone, all has to be considered in the design. So we do see differences among standards in different areas. I would say that the good ones that we've seen don't vary all that much. They just are more conditional to the region and the site and the types of plants that they have.
Does fuel moisture contents have any influence on some of those standards, or does it have any effect depending on where you're at?
That could, and I think if you're talking about the fuel moisture in a seasonal way, if you're looking at what will trigger a certain activity, like a burn ban, for example, that's when a state government, if they have a standard around when people are allowed to use fire and burn things, they will look at certain standards that trigger that call for a ban. So for example, they go out and test and find out that the field moisture is very, very low. They've got high wind conditions. That will be the standard for them to do that. In terms of actual development, a different, a community in Colorado versus a community in Georgia will have a different set of vegetation that they're looking at. So they might, for example, recommend certain uses of certain plants in certain areas versus others, or recommend certain treatments for certain plants. So it's very variable in that sense.
Gotcha. All right. Well, I appreciate you taking those last couple of questions there, Michele. I certainly appreciate the work that Chris is doing out there. Hopefully that fire is under control and stays under control. Thank you. Always good to hear from Susan. She's a friend of mine, and then Stephen as well as Matthew and Elizabeth and David. I appreciate everybody's questions. Thank you, Michele, for your time again. Really, really appreciate it. Do you have any final parting thoughts for us?
I'd just like to thank Green Builder Media and all of you that have joined the session today and hopefully listen to it later. I hope that you'll come visit our websites and consider some of our offerings for your future education and use. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And next month, we're going to have a webinar sponsored by Bosch on, well, car talk. We hope you can join us on Thursday, September 24th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. We're going to have a discussion that we've frankly never had before on this webinar series. It's a discussion on drivetrains, fuel efficiency, electrified cars, and more. So please join us for that. Stay tuned to your inbox for more information from Green Builder Media. Until next month, everybody take care and have a great day.